Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, and after the last few videos where we've been talking about mounts, I have one further video when it comes to discussing mounts in Total War Warhammer. Well, I'm sure we'll have more in the future where I talk about maybe some mounts that are missing from the game that I'd really like to see added, etc, etc. But for today, I wanted to talk about mounts that are in the game that I hate, because I feel like I've just been too positive the last few videos, too excited, too looking forward to the future. Now I want to turn and look into the past, and I want to talk about the things that I despise and that make me angry, because I think it's important to do that from time to time to help give you perspective on things. So I'm going to talk about the most evil mounts in Total War Warhammer today, to which, I mean, I'm going to talk about the mounts that if I could obliterate them from space with the press of a button, I would have already broken that button by hitting it so hard a number of times. So let's go down the list. Now, granted, it's not a absolutely infinite list. It's a fairly small list, but there are a couple things that have caught my attention over the years, and I wish they didn't exist. It would make me much happier if they didn't. Most notably is, let's start with some special characters, and then we'll eventually land on the one generic character I have to complain about. So first up is Teclis. Oh my god, Teclis. So, a couple interesting things to note about Mr. Teclis. So, for those somehow unaware and yet still watching this video, Teclis is of course the big bad wizard of the High Elves. He is the Loremaster of Safari. His whole big deal is that he is very fragile physically, but he makes up for it by being one of the most powerful sorcerers in the world, one of the greatest living magic users. But he is incredibly fragile and is physically weak and has to use a lot of magical equipment and potions to even have the strength to be even like vaguely a threat to someone that gets close to him. Generally speaking, if someone manages to get up on Teclis, he's absolutely doomed. And there's no getting away from that. So one of the core things in his design is that Teclis kind of always ran around on foot. You know, Teclis can ride a horse, that is within his wheelhouse, but he doesn't enjoy doing it. It's very hard on him. And anything bigger than a horse becomes a very big problem. There actually is a scene in Gotrek and Felix, Giant Slayer, where Teclis appears in a part of the story, and he rides a griffin during a part of the story, very briefly, and he hates it. The story goes so out of its way to show how profoundly uncomfortable and unskilled Teclis is as a rider, where the only way he's even able to handle the griffin is he basically has to use magic to like dominate its mind and then force it to take him where he needs to go as quickly as possible so he can get off of it, because not only is he like not physically capable of really being able to get into controlling such a creature, but he also is profoundly uncomfortable just like trusting an animal like that and being that high off the ground, a bunch of other stuff. So Teclis he doesn't do mounts, especially going into battle, because he has to focus almost all of his concentration on just keeping the creature under control. That being said, I think him being able to ride a horse, yeah, no, that's fine. That's good, cool, awesome. But the Arcane Phoenix, are you kidding me? What ridiculous bullcrap is that? That is the dumbest, most absurd thing I have seen in this entire game. There have been many things that Creative Assembly has done that I'm not a fan of, but this takes the cake, or damn near it. It is one of the most bizarre, inexplicable decisions that was ever made. You know, it wasn't like they added it in when the High Elves were introduced. No, it was just randomly thrown in as part of a DLC. They just upgraded Teclis, who was already great. He was already really good. And they took Teclis and made him from being a fragile wizard who is incredibly good at magic, but at the cost that you have to keep him safe, and you have to maneuver him and protect him with other units, because that's kind of like the cost benefit equation. And they just screwed it up. They just walked in and they looked at the tech, like if Teclis had a Bible, right? So, you know, often when they create shows or characters or forms of media, they'll have like a quote unquote Bible, which basically represents a set of guidelines for a show or character or whatever that you must not break. Like, it is fundamental to that universe or character that these rules be obeyed. And the Teclis one should say, not good at close combat. That would be the #1 rule in the Teclis book, is that Teclis should be terrible at close combat. And if something manages to catch him in close combat, he's in a really bad situation. So of course, here comes good old goofball CA to not only give him a monstrous mount, but give him a monstrous mount that is the most powerful of its kind. They didn't give him a Flame Spire Phoenix. Oh, no, no, no. They didn't give him a Frost Phoenix. Oh, no, no, no. Though I do think the Frost Phoenix is scarier. No, they gave him a Arcane Phoenix, which is the best of the three. And the Arcane Phoenix isn't even the original Arcane Phoenix as it was devised in the Monstrous Arcanum, because the original Arcane Phoenix was very different than the Phoenixes we have now. It was much smaller. The Arcane Phoenix instead was changed to be an upgrade of the High Elves' pre-established Phoenixes, which I think is fine. But putting Teclis on that thing, there are so many things wrong with that. I could sit here talking for hours about it, and I would not run out of complaints. Just really nerdy, gimmick, like specific nitpicky complaints. But it's like, okay, we took a character who is supposed to be really strong in some ways, but he has a notable weakness, and we got rid of the notable weakness. We made it so that he's flying, so it's really easy for him to get away from anyone he wants. He causes terror. He has an excellent stat line. There's no like separation between him and the bird. And like, he just gets all these extra bonus abilities. He gets all these extra defenses, like different resistances. It's just like, oh my God, I have never seen a more in your slap in the face, missing the point of a character than this. This would be like releasing a video game and having Samwise from Lord of the Rings as a character. You know, Sam and Frodo, and they give Sam an ability where he gets bonus damage when he's attacking a friend. Like, he has a unique bonus ability he gets that if he attacks a friend or an ally, especially Mr. Frodo, then he gets like all the bonuses. Like, it just spits right in the face of the character and is so obnoxious. It's actually the only one on this list that I would genuinely support being removed from the game. But enough on that. Let's keep the rage going and move on to the next subject. So almost as bad, but so equally as bad from a lore perspective, but I am more understanding of it from a gameplay perspective, is the Tomb Kings. Oh, the Tomb Kings. So Cetra the Imperishable can ride a horse. And I spoke earlier that there was a generic character I was going to talk about as well, and that's the Tomb King fighting characters. Because any Tomb King and any Tomb Prince on a horse is an absolute travesty. That is such a painful, just, oh no. And let me educate you on why that is the case. So, to quote from the Tomb King's 8th edition army book in the Skeleton Chariot section, we get the following entry. Nehekara was the first great civilization of mankind, and the place where men first used horse and chariot in battle. This was a great accomplishment, for horses had only recently been bred as beasts of war, but it was considered undignified for those of noble blood to touch such lowly brutes, let alone ride them. However, with the invention of the chariot, the ruling classes of Nehekara could take to battle with the speed of a stallion. The ancient armies of Nehekara included vast forces of swift chariots, and each carried an arsenal of weaponry. To fight from such an armored platform was thought to be the height of civilized warfare. As such, only royalty and nobility were permitted to fight as charioteers. As befitted their status, charioteers were bedecked in fine armor, precious metals, and valuable jewels. Their chariots were created by skilled artisans, often gilded in gold and covered with images of skulls, bones, and other symbols of the mortuary cult. So here's the thing, right? The Tomb Kings would never, ever, ever in a billion years ride a horse. To them, it was just so far beneath them. They would never even consider it. Those were peasant creatures. Those were dirty, gross creatures that the lowly poor people use to till their fields or run around and do whatever it is poor people do. The Tomb Kings and the Tomb Princes, they would not be caught dead on those things. There was nothing more undead. Yeah. Anyway, there is nothing more important to a Tomb King than pride. So the fact that in Total War Warhammer, not only can you put all the Tomb Princes and Tomb Kings on a horse, what? That's a huge mistake. But Cetra the Imperishable, the most arrogant, prideful son of a bitch in all of Nehekhara, who took such matters so insanely seriously that he would rather kill someone than go back on his word, even if killing that person is disadvantageous to him, because Cetra sees himself as a god. You know, he would never in a million years. Now, granted, this one I'm a little more forgiving of than the Teclis one, because granted, they should have caught it. I'm not sure how they didn't notice when they were looking through the Tomb King book. I don't know how many times to design the Tomb Kings. It somehow didn't occur to them that, oh, it's kind of weird how the Tomb Kings and Tomb Princes can't take horses as a mount. They can only take chariots or war sphinxes. And like, you figure that somebody that worked there would have been like, huh, that's weird. Maybe they made a mistake. And if they made a mistake, then, you know, perhaps we should try and reach out to them about that. Which leads me to two possible options, which is either A, Creative Assembly just didn't care, or B, Games Workshop didn't care. Both of which are equally bad. You know, it's like somebody should have caught that. I think it would have been very nice to have the Tomb Kings appropriately not ride on horses. So your mount options would go foot, then chariot, then war sphinx. There you go. You're done. That would have been very loreful and appropriate. So whenever I see one of those guys on a horse, it makes my it hurts my soul. It hurts me deep down on the lore part. And they even did it. They did it right with the Necrotect. The Necrotect can't ride a horse. He's on foot or a chariot, just like he should be. And I don't understand. I don't understand. Now, let me be clear that Lich Priests, yeah, no, they can ride horses, no problem. So like Katep, Archon the Black was not a nobility. So like, yeah, sure, they can ride horses. But Cetra, Khalida, any of those? No, just terrible. Just terrible. Shame on you. Bad. Awful. Terrible. Moving on. Still kind of talking about the Tomb Kings. I'm not going to gripe on this one as hard because it's something I think could eventually be fixed. But like, the Chariot of the Gods needs to be much better, because Cetra should always value riding the Chariot of the Gods over riding on the Cimmerian War Sphinx. But unfortunately, the Chariot of the Gods continues to underperform, and it's just way better to put him on the War Sphinx. Like, CA has the right idea that the Chariot of the Gods is your highest tier mount with Cetra, but they still have not figured out a way to actually make it the highest tier mount. Because I'm sure I'm not the only person that whenever you look at Cetra, you're like, I could take him on the Chariot of the Gods for style points because it looks really cool. But if I want him to be performing as good as he can and to have the best stat line that he can, I'm going to put him on the War Sphinx. Like, that thing needs to have like a 20% ward save or something to just really make it, you know, the ultimate mount that has been blessed by all of the gods of Nehekhara, instead of just a fancy chariot that is on fire. But who knows? Maybe they'll get it eventually. Moving on to a different character. There's a couple more to go. One character that I think the intentions were good, but once again, it demonstrates a lack of understanding about that character. Has to be Wulfrik the Wanderer. So Wulfrik the Wanderer is the eternal challenger. His whole thing is that he's the world walker. He walks around. He travels with his men, often upon his boat. He arrives somewhere, he gets off, and he walks around, and he goes after people, and he challenges them to duels. And he has these really up close and personal duels where he can really use the gift of tongues to insult them and to make them really angry into making a mistake and all this other stuff. And that only works if Wulfrik is relatively close to the ground and is able to speak to his opponent and trade swords with them. That is what it means to be Wulfrik. So Wulfrik on foot, perfect. That's Wulfrik the Wanderer. On a horse, yeah, sure, no, that's fine. Chaos steed, cool. A chaos chariot, all right, yeah, sure, no, that works. But a war mammoth? That's a little much. Am I wrong? Am I crazy here? That's a little much, guys. That's like, I understand that he's kind of the big character for Norska, and he's one of only 2 that they have right now. So maybe the idea was like, well, we got Throg, and then we got Wulfrik, so I guess Wulfrik should go on a mammoth because he's like the big guy, right? But like, it's not Wulfrik anymore if he's on a mammoth. You can't gift of tongue someone. Like, you're gonna have a whole battlefield where like there's people fighting, and Wulfrik goes up against, I don't know, let's say Cetra riding around on his chariot, and we're realistic. Like, not only is there the sound of the mammoth like walking and trumpeting and roaring, and it's making all this noise, but then Wulfrik's like way the hell far away being like, your mom was fat and your titles suck and you're dumb and all this other bullshit. But like, yeah, like it's literally just gonna be that scene from Kung Fu Panda 2 where he's yelling at Lord Shen and Shen's like, what like, I can't hear you. Like, that would literally just be every interaction with Wulfrik, and he's not doing any of the fighting. Like, it's one of the most, like, listen, I love the War Mammoth. It has brilliant animations, but the characters on mammoths are easily one of the most boring creatures in the game. Like, at least when it's the War Shrine, you know, you got the shaman up there and there's effects and he's kind of like calling the favor of the gods and he's not really focusing on what's going on around him. But like, whenever there's a lord on a mammoth, it's so bad looking because they just sit in their throne and it's usually just them. You know, it's not even like they still have a crew of guys who are throwing javelins and stuff, which they absolutely should. But Wulfrik should not be up there. Wulfrik should never have been up there because he's just not Wulfrik at that point. Like, he's just some fat dude in armor sitting in a chair being a couch potato and I guess vaguely yelling insults at people from like hundreds of feet in the air. It's like, he's just not participating, and he's just not Wulfrik at that point. Wulfrik should be down there trading swords with people, not just sitting his ass down, not even like, he's not even holding his sword, he's not waving it around or anything. He just chills and lets his mammoth do all the work, and it's just not cool, dude. If they want a mammoth character, great, make a new one. Give us Sile the Faithless. Sile the Faithless is really, he rides a war mammoth in his story. There's a whole segment of the Tarmakon book about when he's riding on his war mammoth, and he's a really big, scary Dolgan tribe shaman sorcerer lord. He'd be perfect. You know, he'd give us a shaman sorcerer character, so he'd be all, you know, all sorts of cool chaos magic, and he could ride a war mammoth, and he could be the war mammoth guy. That'd be awesome. You know, Wulfrik really should have been the chariot or like infantry guy. He should be all about buffing the hell out of your like marauder champions and making them much cheaper and stronger, and maybe buffing your chariots and, you know, all this other stuff. Like, they just kind of aimed him at the mammoths, I think, because they're like, mammoths are the cool part of the roster, like the really big cool part of the roster, so let's just give them mammoth stuff. And I don't know, it just feels lazy. It was lazy. It was super lazy, guys. Like, just, he should be about the humans, the Norscan people in the roster. And then if you want the other things to get big and cool, then there are other characters to bring in. You want someone to focus really hard on like the were creatures, like the skin wolves. Well, then bring in Bjorg Bearstruck, and then you have a big focus on werebears and skin wolves. You want a big mammoth guy? Well, bring in Sile the Faithless. And then, you got Throg over there chilling with the trolls and monsters and stuff. And, hopefully we can get a familiar character eventually. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're moving on to the next thing, which is that the Dark Elves have a very similar problem with Lokhir Fellheart and his bizarre, out of left field named Black Dragon, Maelstrom. Now, I will say, Maelstrom is a super badass name for a Black Dragon. And I can also see the argument that Lokhir Fellheart rules from a Black Ark, so, he's got room for a dragon on there. Maybe he would get on a dragon and ride it around, because if he did that, then, he could, maybe get into battle faster and all this other stuff. But once again, I just kind of have to point at the whole thing of, we know how Lokhir Fellheart fights. We actually have a lot of literature from the various Dark Elf army books over the years that describe Lokhir Fellheart's fighting style. And Lokhir Fellheart always fights on foot because he has this really super cool agile fighting style where he's like leaping from person to person. He's doing all these crazy acrobatics, and he's all about fighting on the deck of his ship. That is what he does, is that he fights people face to face. He lets his regeneration do a lot of the heavy carrying for him, because regen wouldn't carry over to his dragon. The helmet doesn't work on him and everyone he's touching. It's not like it's not a power of friendship beam where if he likes you, he passes on the regen. Nah, it's only him. It's exclusive to him. And so he's always fighting man to man among his crew because he's a master raider. That's his whole thing. Like, he should have been a foot only character. I feel like they just kind of looked at him. They were like, dragons are cool. Let's put him on a dragon. But like, why? Why would you put him on a dragon? Like, we already have a dragon character. We got Malekith up on Seraphon, and then we got Rakarth up on I forgot what his dragon is called all of a sudden. But like, we've got 2 Dark Elf dragon characters already, on top of all the generic characters that can ride dragons. Why do we need another dragon for a legendary lord? Like, come on. You're oversaturating the market. Like, I realize that, sure, there's a lot of times where foot characters just don't seem like they're that great. But first of all, I think the tide has been kind of changing on that. I think foot characters are significantly better than they used to be, especially because we actually are starting to get many more battles that care about like objectives and not just land battles where your goal is to basically just snipe the enemy lord as fast as possible, because that's no longer like the only objective. Because land battles, like, I love them, they can be fun, but they're kind of basic. And I think foot characters benefit much more in the new systems. But it's like they're, instead of finding a way to make foot characters better, it seems like there was a point in Warhammer 2 where they just gave up on that. And we're like, what if we just gave every single character in the game a monstrous mount? Maybe if every single legendary lord became the exact same, and instead of one of them having a gimmick where like he's the best at riding a particular mount, what if we just said fuck that and gave every single character in the game the exact same mounts, because that way they're all the same, and it's boring and it's dumb and I hate it. Moving on, the last character I'm going to bitch about today, because there's actually not that many in the grand scheme of things, is Aranessa Saltspite. And this one I don't think that many people disagree with, and it's that Aranessa Saltspite's a really cool character, and she has really cool animations where she does like her little stripper dance or whatever, and she like is like chopping people up. Granted, like, her character definitely could use some improvements, but that's more from like a campaign perspective, and like, overall she kind of just needs more. I think like if she's ever going to appear in like a multiplayer scenario, I think that's only going to be because like of cost scenario where it's like you have to make her so cheap that she's able to give you a really efficient character for the cost, but then you have to buy a wizard and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that Aranessa has a crab that she can ride, but I don't know why you would ride the crab. Like, the crab takes away all the cool parts of Aranessa, which is that she loses all her unique animations, and she literally just sits on the crab and lets the Promethean do the fighting for her. And it's just kind of like, all right, like, it's not awful, but why? why would you take this really cool thing and make it super not cool? She doesn't really do anything on it. She doesn't have any special interaction with it. It's not like she's the only character that can do it. Literally every single character in the Vampire Coast roster that can have a mount that's generic can ride a crab. So I don't know. It just kind of made Aranessa feel very bleh. You know, it's like, I feel like maybe that could have been better invested somewhere else. But that is the end of the characters I'm going to complain about. And this is where the video would end, but I'm not done yet. And the reason I'm not done yet is because I don't like making purely negative videos. So, haha, I tricked you. You thought I was just going to bitch and moan this entire time, but you're wrong. Because I'm actually going to very briefly and with basically no explanation talk about all the mounts that have been added to characters that I think are super badass and really help explore those characters a lot better, or really just kind of upgrade them in sense that fits perfectly with their designs and narrative. So just very quickly going down the list, Eagle and Horse for Alariel. It's a little overpowered, but by God, it makes perfect sense, and I'm shocked that we never saw her really on any of those during the tabletop days. And I mean, granted, in tabletop, they really just kind of liked having like one character per mount option because that was kind of their gimmick, and then they didn't write anything else. But like Alariel, like really feels like a character that should have access to like big animals because, you know, she's an embodiment of Aisha. So yeah, Eagle, Horse, great, perfect. The Casket of Souls for Kotep, I love it. It's amazing. DJ Kotep is great and made him an even better character than he already was. Necro Serpent for Khalida, from a really nitpicky lore standpoint, that really probably shouldn't be a thing because Necro Serpents are bound to their writers and they're animated by a single soul. Necro Serpents are actually not separate entities. They're not animals. They're literally just bound to their writers, and it's just one guy essentially. But it looks really cool. It's extremely thematic. It helps give Khalida a really unique design. And frankly, you know, she's the favored of Asaf. And if Asaf was going to give anybody an exception to the rule, it would be Khalida because she's her favorite. She's her boo. So yeah, great job. I actually think it's really cool. Even if it kind of doesn't make sense from the lore, I think fuck the lore at that point. Rule of cool. And it still fits the character. And it still allows her to be a really powerful duelist. She just has like a cool mount instead of just being on foot or chariot. Brood Horror for Throt, perfect, makes perfect sense. I think that's something we probably would have seen in tabletop, but Brood Horrors didn't exist when Throt was created. Ikit Claw in the Doom Wheel also makes perfect sense. Actually makes better sense than you may personally think, because Ikit Claw actually invented the Doom Wheel. He created the first ever Doom Wheel. So him having a Doom Wheel at a mount is so perfect that it's kind of difficult to properly put it into words, but that, you know, that'll have to suffice. But, you know, he's its inventor. Of course he would have one, and he would have the best one. Moving on, Teclis on a horse, I actually think is really solid. Teclis used to only be restricted to foot because the whole thing is that they kind of knew you'd always be protecting him in a unit, so it didn't really make sense to put him on anything but on foot. But having him on a horse, I think, is completely reasonable and allows him to get around the field at a higher pace. And it's also like, would Teclis ride an Ithmel Barded Steed? Yes, of course he would. I don't think he'd have any issues with that. You know, generally speaking, I think he'd prefer to get around by like teleporting. And like when he fights in the battlefields in the books, Teclis's literal go-to move is he uses this spell where he's able to walk on air, and he creates an invisible set of steps essentially, and he always walks up above the battlefield where he basically is floating on an invisible platform that he conjures, and he like just rains magic down on people or duels other wizards from that high vantage point. He does that in multiple books, so it's kind of just his move, but you can't really show that in any way in Total War Warhammer. So I think giving him a horse so that he's able to like move around and be places is a good way to do that. In the event, and you know, it gets him a little higher, so he's above infantry height and he can like see what's going on and all those stuff. Moving on, the Zombie Dragon for Manfred von Karstein. This one I personally get a little butthurt about sometimes because I feel like Manfred being on a dragon makes it harder for me to argue that Zacharias the Ever-Living is like an immediate thing we need as soon as we get our next vampire count update. But, you know, I can still feel that way personally while acknowledging that Manfred on a zombie dragon makes perfect sense, especially because in the Vampire Count 8th edition book, they write a story about Manfred riding a zombie dragon and then proceeded to not give him a zombie dragon mount in the rule book. Why? Why would they do that? So I always thought that was very bizarre. and kind of dumb that they give us a whole thing about him riding on a zombie dragon and then just don't let us do that. And the reason they did that is because they didn't want to make a new model for him, and they were really inconsistent about sometimes they would create models where they're like, oh, you could play this model, but you have to kit bash it yourself. And sometimes they would be like, oh, just kidding, here's the model. But for whatever reason, I guess they were like, we don't want to make a new Manfred model until the end time, so screw it, we're not going to do it. But anyway, you know, it just matches into the story. And then a horse for Kimmler. Once again, Kimmler is kind of one of those characters that it was, you know, he had rules that were designed for him to be inside of a unit. So they kind of always just imagined you would do that. He always was kind of supposed to have Carl right next to him. So like you wouldn't really have a reason to put him on a mount. But in a game like Total War Warhammer, where, you know, characters don't have bodyguards, they're just kind of running around, him having a steed makes a lot more sense. Especially because one of Kimmler's gimmicks in tabletop was the Cloak of Mist and Shadows, which could do one of two things. It could either make Kimmler ethereal, so he could only be hurt by magic or magical weapons, or he could fly. So he would literally just move 20 inches across the table. He would just fly. Like, just, you know, imagining a character just like, phoo, and they go run away. So it was a way for him to reposition. But he can't do that in Total War Warhammer. The Mystic Cloak and Shadows basically only gives him the ethereal property. So giving him a horse kind of helps solve that situation. So good job there. And then there are a lot of other mounts that I could point to, like Tehinuin and the red-crested skink chief having ripperdactyls, super badass. Red-crested skink riding on a horned one, super badass, and a great reference to Tichuichi's raiders. But the last one I'm really going to focus on is the 3 other legendary lords in the Vampire Coast. Solostra Deerfawn riding on a rotting leviathan, perfect. Awesome. Gives her like a big operatic stage from which to unleash magic and like greatly increases her potential, and it looks super badass. Love it. And really shows how she's like favored by Stromfels as he awakens this big monstrous creature from the depths for her to ride upon. And then you have Luther Harkin riding on an abyssal terrorgeist, or whatever the hell the special variant they have called. Looks really freaking cool, and he's the only non-Strigoi we see riding a terrorgeist. And it kind of like, oh yeah, I totally believe that he would come across a terrorgeist in the jungles of Lustria. That would make complete sense for one of those to be there. And he's able to, like, you know, get it to raise with his weird way that he raises corpses, because he doesn't do it actively. He does it kind of more on accident. And then the good old Noctilus being able to ride on a Necrofex Colossus, if memory serves. Looks really cool, like, and it is a really good kind of, not, you know, tip of the hat to him being on his ship, because his vessel, the Bloody Reaver, is very similar in identity, where it's kind of like this assorted mass of undead bits and ships, and then there's a creature that's literally an embodiment of that, and putting him on top of that just is a really cool way to call to that iconography. And it really fits his character, and he looks really badass up there. And plus, those things are known to be able to have characters kind of more in them than on them, but like you could bind a character to them in the original tabletop version from the Monstrous Arcanum. So doing that made sense, even though the way he does it is technically unique, but like it just looks really cool with him up in the crow's nest. So that is going to be the end of this video. Sorry, I kind of had to rush through that last part because this video is already getting long and I need to wrap it up. In any event, let me know your thoughts down below. Are there any mounts that I talked about and did you learn anything? Was there anything where you're like, oh, I didn't realize that character shouldn't be on that? That's dumb. I hate that. Was there anything that I said where you said, Sotek, you're stupid and shut up, nerd? Do let me know down in the comments below what your thoughts are on all that jazz. In any event, this has been Loremaster Sotek. I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.